Let's examine the different frameworks associated with ASP.NET. As you can see right here, we have three different frameworks. You have the full .NET framework, you have Mono, and .NET Core. And as you can see, my application signifies what my application is associated with ASP.NET. Under that, I have the DNX, the .NET Execution Runtime. And below that, I have the .NET Framework, Mono, and .NET Core. As you notice with the .NET Framework and Mono, they go to the CLR. And this is associated with the different types and the runtime on that specific machine or operating system. The only difference between the .NET Framework and Mono is that Mono is cross-platform, but it's tied to the machine specifically. In comparison to the .NET Core, it runs through the Core CLR. It does not tie specifically to the machine. It runs in its own process. So one thing to keep in mind is that the .NET Framework and Mono both run through their own CLR, and then it executes. But with .NET Core, you're not based on the web server. You're not based on the machine itself. It runs in its own process, and it doesn't have to be coupled with the machine itself. Mono and the .NET Core are both cross-platform. It just depends on what version you want to install when you install the DNX runtime. These are some application differences between an ASP.NET Full Framework app and an ASP.NET Core app. With the first item, when you create an ASP.NET Full Framework app, your application runs through the root folder. There's no www root folder. So everything that is in that application folder is exposed. In ASP.NET Core, you have the www root folder. Everything outside of that is not available to be accessed by someone else. With the full framework application, it's Visual Studio dependent. Now, you don't always have to build it in Visual Studio. You can always cross-build with Mono and a text editor or Sublime Text, but a lot of the IntelliSense associated with building in .NET is with Visual Studio. In ASP.NET Core, we've run through some examples that it can run through Linux, Mac OS X, and Visual Studio Code, and the Yeoman generator can build our apps outside of the Visual Studio dependency. So there's a lot of support for ASP.NET Core outside of Visual Studio. Another big item is system.web. With the full framework app, all of the class libraries are associated with specifically system.web, and it's dependent on that. With ASP.NET Core, there is no dependency on system.web. Microsoft built it from the ground up so that it can be decoupled away from this DLL. In ASP.NET, web.config and XML is where all of your configurations reside, and everything is read from that. In IIS, it will read your web.config, and then it will associate what configuration you have in this application. With ASP.NET Core, you have JSON, you have an INI file, and XML. Specifically, it ties a project.json to all of your configurations as far as what DLLs you're going to associate with your NuGet packages, what commands are you going to run, what version you're on, and this works better for cross-platform development. In a full framework app, there's no dependency injection. In ASP.NET Core, everything is a dependency injection. So you have your startup.cs file, and in your startup.cs file, you can inject what services you want to run inside of your application. So in future tutorials, we will examine Entity Framework, and we will inject our Entity Framework context in our startup.cs file, and then from there, we can pass as a constructor to our controller that context and reuse it inside of a dependency injection environment. A full framework app is tied to a configuration, an IIS, typically with your web.config or your app settings. In ASP.NET Core, it's decoupled from the configuration, so the application is its own process, and it's not tied to the specific machine or the machine code associated on your operating system. And finally, the keynote difference between ASP.NET Full Framework app and ASP.NET Core app. A full framework app is not cross-platform. An ASP.NET Core app is cross-platform, so it can run on Mac OS X, Linux, and Windows. In the three subsequent tutorials, I showed you how to build it on Windows, Mac OS X, and Linux. In the next lecture, we will actually compare an ASP.NET Full Framework app to an ASP.NET Core app and compare the differences between the config, the modules, the dependency injection, and how everything runs between the two different applications. I want to thank you for joining me in this lecture. Have a nice day.